So the next thing I looked as a journalist, as I investigated this, was what did clinicians, what did psychiatrists say about the course of schizophrenia in their patients now that they were moving from a non-drug model to a drug model? Because they were used to seeing what happened to patients who weren't medicated, right? And so this is the clinical perception. And you will find two things. They will say, yeah, these medications seem to be helping people get better faster, but now they're returning to the hospital in droves. And they even created a term for that. They called it the revolving door syndrome that comes in the 60s. That's one perception. The second perception is they say, and it seems that those who relapse while on drugs or after exposure to drugs have more severe relapses than placebo relapses. So again, there was a sense that maybe something's going wrong with this paradigm of care. Now, in response to that, a gentleman named Samuel Bovan, who was a pretty well-known researcher at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, he conducted a retrospective study. So what he did is he looked at his outcomes of his psychotic patients treated in 1947, and he looked at their 5-year outcomes, which he had tracked, and then he compared those outcomes to the outcomes he was getting together with a cohort of psychotic patients in 1967 treated with medications. And what did he find? He found that the relapse rate was higher in the modern era, and that the modern group, the 1967 cohort, were more socially dependent. They were more likely to be on welfare. So what does Bovan conclude in his article? He says, rather unexpectedly, these data suggest that psychotropic drugs may not be indispensable. Their extended use in aftercare may prolong the social dependency of many patients. So that's what he got from his retrospective. Now this also led the NIMH in the 1970s to fund 2 trials to see if a different use of medication, in essence, could produce a better result. And these are the only 2 trials that do this over any long period of time that we have in the literature. And each of the trials basically had this design, with first episode schizophrenia patients. One group would be randomized into normal treatment in a hospital with drug. The other group would be randomized into an arm which made selective use of the medications. And what do I mean by that? They weren't immediately put on antipsychotics. Now they might use benzodiazepines to help people sleep and control the agitation. And then they would see if at least some of those patients could get better without going on antipsychotics. And then if they didn't, if they weren't getting better after 3-4 weeks, then they would put them on antipsychotic, okay? And then there was also a sense that we'll just see how long they need to be on, and maybe not everybody needs to be on them long term. So it is not a no medication model, it is a selection model, selective use model. And by the way, also in this experimental arm, they would be given a lot of psychosocial care. Social support, etc. One of them was the Soteria house, living among other people to be with, etc. So it's not a drug versus placebo. It's really conventional care versus psychosocial care plus selective use of medications. Now what did they find? One was done by Maurice Rappaport. He found A, better outcomes in the experimental group overall. 2, 24 of the 41 newly schizophrenic patients never needed to go on medications throughout the 3-year study. And by the end of the 3-year, it was that group, never exposed to medication, that had by far the best outcome. Okay, by far. So what does he conclude? Maurice Rappaport, I think it's around 1978. He says, our findings suggest that antipsychotic medication is not the treatment of choice, at least for certain patients, if one is interested in long-term clinical improvement. Many unmedicated while in hospital patients showed greater long-term improvement, less pathology at follow-up, fewer rehospitalizations, and better overall functioning in the community than patients who were given Thorazine while in the hospital. Okay, so what he's saying here in his finding is at least there's a group that can do better off. Okay, then Loren Moshe ran his famous Soteria project at the same time. His was a 2-year study, same sort of thing. That in his experimental group, at the end of 2 years, they had lower psychopathology scores, fewer readmissions as a group, and better global adjustment. In terms of medication use, 42% were never exposed to antipsychotics, 39% on a temporary basis, and only 19% on a continual basis. What did Loren Moshe conclude? Our findings suggest that antipsychotic medication is not the treatment of choice. At least for, oh, I've done the same thing. I'm sorry. Basically, I've repeated the same thing, did that wrong. Basically, he said same thing. If you're looking for long-term clinical improvement, there's a group that will do better if you don't put them on medications and you don't medicate them long-term. And he says, we need to rethink the use of antipsychotics, is what he says. Real quick, because I know I need to wrap this up. Believe it or not, there was a gentleman at the NIMH at the time named William Carpenter who raised he also did a study comparing unmedicated versus medicated patients. 1 year, the unmedicated patients had slightly better outcomes. And he raises a profound question. It's in 1978. He says, we know that once people are on antipsychotic medication, they are more vulnerable to relapse if then withdrawn than if maintained. But we raise the possibility that going on the medication actually makes people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis than they would normally be in the natural course of their illness. So there's this paradox he's raising. There was people from the University of Montreal at that time that explained what was happening, and they said, listen, you're increasing these dopamine receptors, that's why you're getting the relapse, and that's actually where they call it supersensitive psychosis. You are probably making people more vulnerable to psychosis long-term than they would be normally in the course of the illness. So it was a big warning flag. Now, what has happened since then? That worry. And by the way, Jonathan Cole, who was the gentleman who was like the father of American psychopharmacology, who did that first NIMH study in 1978, he wrote a paper called, Is the Cure Worse Than the Disease? And what he said was, what his recommendation was, every single patient should be given a chance to go off medication because it looks like about 50% could do better off. Now, I want to emphasize here, he's not saying that some people don't do better on. All right, he's just making, all this is doing is carving out a much more subtle form of use. And what you're really seeing is here, can there be short-term benefit? Yes. Do some people apparently need to be on the medications? The gods are telling me to shut up. Mom, your time is up. I pause it. Okay. Anyway, the point is, it's basically, this is not a non-medication thing. It's an artful use of medication. You're trying to figure out who needs them, who does not, and for what length of time. Okay, it's a best use model. Real quickly, 3 long-term studies since then. Does it support this idea or not? Courtney Harding, she does a long-term study of schizophrenia patients released from the back wards of Vermont State Hospital, 1950s, and what does she find? She finds that 25 years later, 1/3 are completely recovered. And although, which is great, right? What she doesn't make really well known, although she eventually says this, is all those completely recovered, she said, had long since gotten off their medication. And so what did she conclude? She said it is a myth that people with schizophrenia need to be on medication all their lives, and it may be a small percentage. So she's reinforcing this idea of selective use, right? If you go to the World Health Organization studies, which got me started on this, World Health Organization twice conducted studies that ran 2 to 5 years that compared outcomes in the poor countries of the world with outcomes in the U.S. and other rich countries. Each time the outcomes were significantly better in the poor countries. In fact, the World Health Organization concluded that living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor that you will never fully recover. Okay, that failure was, by the way, why I began investigating this whole story, because I didn't understand the failure. Now, after the first study, the World Health Organization investigators actually hypothesized maybe the reason people do better in the poor countries of the world is they're more medication compliant. So they looked at medication usage, and what did they find? They found that in the poor countries, only 16% were regularly maintained on medication continuously, whereas in the rich countries, of course, it was a standard of care. So again, you see some association with a different use of, paradigm for using the medications. Finally, we have a very important study by Martin Harrow that really, I would say, you can ignore. We as a society need to discuss this study. We need to sort of have a national discussion. Martin Harrow is a psychologist from the University of Illinois, and beginning in the 1980s, he began following a group of 84 schizophrenia patients. And all he did is he looked at them at 2 years, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, and he looked at, are they working? Are they asymptomatic? Do they have a good life? And are they on or off medication? Okay, it's just a naturalistic study. And what did he find? At the end of 2 years, those off medication were doing a little better as a group than those on medication. But then from 2 to 4.5 years, the off medication group as a group continued to get better, whereas the on medication group sort of flatlined, such that by the end of 4.5 years, 40% of patients off medication were in recovery versus 5% of those on medication. An 8-time... They don't want this message heard. Okay, second of all, so that's one finding. The second of all, Martin Harrow's study really had 3 outcomes. He had people in the recovered category. By the way, to be in the recovered category, you had to be working at least 50% of the time, or in school 50% of the time, okay? So he actually had 3 outcomes. In recovery, so-so, poor, okay? Off medication, long-term, it was like this. 40% recovery, 43% in the so-so, 17% in the uniformly poor category, okay? By the way, this is the best naturalistic longitudinal study we have today in America, funded by the NIMH. For those on medication, here was the breakdown of outcomes. 5% in recovery, 47% roughly in the so-so, and 47% in the uniformly poor. It was as if there was a shift to the chronicity end. He also looked about psychotic symptoms. Those on medication, roughly 68% at the end of 15 years were still suffering psychotic symptoms. Only 28% of those off medication still were. So there was a lot more psychotic activity in those on medication. So what did Martin Harrow conclude? He went to he published this in 2007, he went to the 2008 American Psychiatric Association meeting, and he said, among other things, our data is overwhelming that not all people need to be on medication all their lives. And what Martin Harrow said is, there was a group of patients from the beginning that seemed to have a better sense of self, more willpower. And it was that group that got off medication and did well. So what he's really saying is, again, it goes back to this, there is a group out there that can descend into psychosis, but they have a better sense of self, and that we really should be trying to get them off medication long term, because they have a real chance of sort of full-body recovery. And by the way, in that poor group, more than half were working at the end of 15 years. Some of them had quite good jobs. I think there was a lawyer, there was a professor, and Martin Harrow said something really interesting. He said, these people disappear from the system. Those who get off the medications and do well, they don't come back to their clinicians, so we don't see these people who do well. Now, I will tell you, for doing this book, I interviewed a number of people who had left the system and had been once diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they do not want to be known as having been, quote, schizophrenic, and they really do disappear.